Welcome. Today, we're diving into the Caro-Kann Defense, one of the most solid and reliable openings in chess. Whether you're a beginner or an advanced player, mastering this defense can give you a strong position and long-term strategic advantage. Let's break it down. White begins with pawn to e4, and you respond with pawn to c6. This setup is known as the Caro-Kann Defense. White immediately takes full control of the center, and that's when you strike back with pawn to d5, challenging control of the board. At this point, White has three main choices: capturing the pawn, advancing forward, or defending it. We will explore each of these possibilities, but I don't want to overwhelm you with too many details. Instead, I'll provide a simple game plan that works across all variations. This part is crucial. First, let's understand the role and positioning of each piece. The two central pawns aim to control and contest the center, which is why we played pawn to d5. If White captures, you simply recapture. We simplify the center, entering the exchange variation of the Caro-Kann defense. Now, let's focus on the knight. In almost all cases, you will place the knight on the c6 square, as its primary role is to apply pressure on the central pawns. So always remember, your knight belongs on c6. Next, let's talk about the bishop. In the Caro-Kann defense, this bishop is typically developed to either f5 or g4. If White develops the knight to f3, then g4 becomes the ideal square for the bishop, as it pins the knight and indirectly increases pressure on the center. However, if White's knight is not on f3, then placing the bishop on g4 is not ideal due to the queen's presence. In that case, you can simply develop the bishop to f5. In this position, since the knight is already developed, we play bishop to g4. Now let's discuss the other bishop. Once the light-squared bishop moves out of the pawn chain, it becomes a good idea to push the pawn to e6. This move strengthens our pawn structure, creating a solid chain while also opening up the diagonal for the dark-squared bishop. After White castles, you can develop the dark-squared bishop, but before that, let's talk about the other knight. Ideally, when the f6 square is available, you should aim to place your knight there for strong central control. However, in some variations, White may have a pawn on d5, making knight to f6 impossible. In such cases, you will need to reposition your knight to g6 or f5, adapting to the structure of the game. I will demonstrate this in other variations, but for now, since f6 is available, we place the knight there. Now, if White attacks our bishop with a pawn, we will simply capture the knight. The reason for this is that White's knight is a strong defender of the center, so eliminating it is usually a good strategic choice. After we capture the knight, White will recapture with a pawn, and now we can proceed with developing our bishop. There are generally two good squares for this bishop, but since we have a clear open diagonal, bishop to d6 is a strong option. Next, ensuring king safety is crucial, so we castle on the king side. Finally, it is time to activate our queen and bring it into the game. But at the moment, this bishop is defending the knight, so we need to take action. We start by attacking with pawn to h6, forcing the bishop to retreat. Then, we push again, driving it back even further. This sequence creates a fantastic opportunity to exchange the bishops, which damages White's pawn structure and weakens the king's safety. In fact, we can immediately take advantage of this. Can you spot the idea? Yes, we play queen to b6, targeting both of these pawns and putting immediate pressure on White's exposed king. It is only move number 14, and these are the kinds of dominant positions you can achieve with the Caro-Kann defense. By the way, if at any point White tries to pin your knight, there is no need to worry. Even if White captures the knight, you end up with an improved pawn structure that further strengthens your control of the center. Now, with all these key concepts in mind, we can easily handle the most common moves that White may play. So, let's explore some of the important variations. After the pawn exchange, let's say White plays pawn to c4. This is known as the Panov variation. Now remember all the principles we discussed earlier, as they will guide us through every variation. Here we have the option to capture the pawn, but doing so allows White to activate the light-squared bishop, which is something we should try to avoid. We could play knight to c6, but instead it's often better to reinforce the pawn first. Since we already know that knight to f6 is a strong placement, we should develop it there first. Keep in mind, while our strategic ideas remain the same, the move order is flexible. It is completely fine to adjust your sequence based on the situation and your requirements. So in this position, instead of developing this knight immediately, we can first bring out the other knight. Once you feel comfortable, then you can proceed with knight to c6. If White decides to capture, that actually benefits you because the pawn on d4 becomes isolated and significantly weaker. Now if White develops the knight to f3, you already know the best move, right? yes, develop the bishop to g4. However, exchanging this knight is not ideal because it allows white to recapture with the pawn, strengthening its defense. So, it's best to avoid that trade. If white plays bishop to e2, then it's time to activate your dark squared bishop. First, play pawn to e6, and then you can develop your bishop to either d6 or e7. Both are reasonable options. If white's knight captures, taking back with the pawn would leave it isolated, so it is better to recapture with the queen. Finally, once your development is complete, it is time to ensure king safety by castling. Our strategy remains the same. Just follow the fundamental principles of chess, and you will be in a strong position. We have analyzed the exchange variation of the Caro-Kann defense. Now, let's look at the most common response from white, pawn to e5. By advancing forward, white enters the advance variation. In this position, you cannot immediately develop your knights, so what should you do? Do you remember the main role of these pawns? They are meant to contest the center. That's why we push pawn to c5, putting pressure on white's pawn while also freeing an important square for our knight. If white decides to capture, do not worry. These pawns will become weak, and we can easily regain control over them in the next few moves. Now, playing pawn to e6 right away would block our light-squared bishop, so we need to be patient. Instead, let's first develop the knight and directly attack white's central pawn. If white develops the knight to f3, you already know the best move. Just pin the knight with your bishop. Once the bishop is developed, you can safely play pawn to e6. Now, this pawn is under threat. If white tries to defend it, you can play bishop to e2, but then what about your knight? Remember, I mentioned earlier that in some variations, you won't be able to place your knight on the usual square. This is exactly what I was referring to. By playing bishop to e2, you also take away an important square from your knight, leaving it with no immediate development options. In such situations, our plan is to maneuver the knight to either f5 or g6. To do this, we first move the knight to e7. Meanwhile, if white attacks our bishop, you already know the correct response. We exchange the bishops, and then we can simply capture the pawn. From here, the plan remains the same. Reposition the knight, develop the bishop, and ensure king safety by castling on the king's side. It's a simple and effective strategy. Following a similar approach in the advance variation, after playing pawn to c5, even if white defends the pawn, we will continue developing our knight as usual. If white captures the pawn, we simply take with the pawn to e5, leaving white with doubled pawns, which is advantageous for us. Even if white plays a standard development move like knight to f3, we can now exchange the pawns and develop the bishop as we normally would. If white attacks the bishop, we capture the knight, and after white recaptures with the queen, we can then capture a free pawn. If white doesn't play pawn to h3 and continues with normal development, we will stick to the same game plan. First, we play pawn to e6, and since the knight cannot go to its usual square, we move the knight to e7. If white tries something like bishop to g5, we can respond with the brilliant queen to b6, launching a double attack. This puts white in serious trouble. I hope you understand all variation. If you think this video is helpful, then like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.